Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come and hear about email interviewing. As Sue said, my name is Lucy. I'll try and keep it fairly informal, speak for about half an hour, and then open it up for discussion after that. You can ask any questions. So just a brief overview of what email interviewing is. In recent years, the internet has become an increasingly popular tool for researching social life. And this talk draws on my experience of using email interviews and online research to research popular music and the life course. So my particular research area for my PhD looked at how ageing shapes music consumption. And I'll talk briefly and draw on some of the methodological issues that were raised through researching popular music and ageing online and using the internet. Now, email interviews were particularly suited to my research area, as I was asking people to provide written accounts of their experiences, their memories and recollections of long-term involvement within music scenes. So their experiences of involvement in particular music scenes. And I use the term email interviewing, but there are various names given to the process of using the internet to interview people. So we have terms like online interviewing, e-interviewing, electronic interviewing, but I tend to use the term email interviewing. There is another quite heavy jargon-like term, asynchronous computer-mediated communication, which is what you often see in a lot of the academic literature. But put very simply, email interviewing refers to conducting interviews via email asynchronously. So this asynchronous element is quite important. It allows the respondent to answer at their own time, their own pace, and over a relatively long period of time. And that is in comparison to traditional interviewing methods where one might interview someone face to face. So it very much affords time for the participant. In my research, I gave participants a choice of being interviewed either via email or face-to-face, and the vast majority wanted to be interviewed via email. And I think this was because they found it less obtrusive, more flexible, and more convenient in the main. So what this talk will do is reflect on the differences between the written and oral accounts and focus on the practicalities of conducting email interviews. And I'll also discuss some of the advantages and limitations of using email interviews as a research method. So I just want to give a brief historical overview of emailing as a research method. So as we'll all be aware, there's been a vast growth in information and communication technologies in the last decade, or from sort of the mid-90s onwards. And this provides new opportunities for researchers. So researchers can examine how traditional research methods may be adopted for online research. And there's quite a significant book by Mann and Stewart that was published in 2000. And in this book, they look at how internet technology can be adapted or can help to adapt qualitative methods of data collection. And they argue that through internet technology, researchers can gain in-depth and descriptive data online and help to understand human experience. Now, the growth in email use, it's obviously widespread in the academic community and in many professions and businesses, and it personally, hasn't really been matched by the use of email interviewing in research. So the discussion of technology and email interviewing as a research tool is quite scarce, but it has expanded since around sort of 2007. There's been quite a proliferation of material, but it still is quite scarce and quite an innovative approach to research. Now, as I said earlier, all the respondents in my research were offered the choice of either a face-to-face or an email interview, and email was viewed favourably. So I posted invitations to take part in the research online, and then I did them in music venues as well. And I handed out flyers at gigs and in nightclubs to try and recruit participants. So online recruitment and email interviewing were very successful in terms of the study that I conducted. And following posts online and in venues, I received around 55 emails from people who wanted to be interviewed electronically. And this was quite significant compared to people who wanted to meet up face to face. But something that needs to be taken into account when conducting email interviewing is how email can exclude certain groups. So we need to think about who feels comfortable writing accounts and who has the time to devote to writing lengthy descriptions, if this is what you're asking participants to do. Now, it is possible that you'll exclude participants by asking them to conduct email interviews, which is why I always gave the option of either email or face-to-face. In my research, there was a bit of a gender bias. It was the men who tended to want to do email interviewing. This could have been due to the wording of the flyers and the advertisements that may have led to a certain type of music fan wanting to take part in the research. And there was a lack of women in the study, and I ended up having to target women to come forward to take part in the study. And this could have been to do with the method or to do with my recruitment advertisements. So I had to try and increase the number of female respondents. I had to direct adverts at female fans and always give the option of a face-to-face interview. So men were more likely to demonstrate an interest in taking part in the research across all the music scenes that I studied. So the method of email interviewing might favour the more articulate and those who are confident about writing. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. And we've also got to consider whether the research area, the topic, fits with online research methods, whether it lends itself to conducting research online. So it's very important to ensure that both the researcher and the participant find the method mutually acceptable. It tends to favour daily users of email or the internet, and they might be most likely to be comfortable answering questions online. Now, another issue is the nature of the data with email interviewing. So in asking respondents to relay accounts of their experiences, their involvement in music scenes or other forms of social life, there were marked differences between the written, the email account, and the oral face-to-face account. So I think that both written and email accounts are conscious constructions of one's past and present self, and they can mythologise and produce a rehearsed narrative. But the written account, the email interview data, is potentially a more carefully crafted or polished account. The email interview gives the participant the ability to scroll through their answer, to edit it, to delete the bits, to modify. And it's important to consider that the writer can potentially present a narrative in accordance with what they think the academic world and a potential reader might want to know. So the e-interview or the email interview needs to be understood as a mediated version of a respondent's past or present involvement or experiences. Now, in terms of practicalities, in the research, the email interviews were based on the same topic guide as the face-to-face interviews, but this was very flexible because I created a thread of email data using Gmail, Google Mail as the account that I set up, and this was separate to my personal and work email account. And I think Gmail is worth having a look at if you want to conduct this type of research or use this type of method, because it very neatly bundles emails together for you, and you can label them, you can put stars next to them to highlight certain things, and it very neatly creates an email thread between the researcher and the respondent. So it's a very useful email account for conducting research. Now, the length of time taken to respond to questions varied. So I would send some initial questions to the respondent and then send more questions based on their answers. Now, some interviewees sent their answers back on the same day, and I would then ask more questions, and it would end after a couple of days. However, there was a few respondents, particularly a Northern Soul fan, who emailed an answer at a time, and this produced very extensive, rich data. And he emailed me over a 7-month period where I'd ask more questions and he'd get back to me with his answers. And sometimes there'd be Word documents up to like 10 pages long just for one answer. So it was a very rich, extensive form of data. Now, I responded to the participants' preliminary answers by asking more questions based on the answers, asking for clarification and important issues that may have emerged from the data. So as I said, there was an email thread formed between the researcher and the respondent that were based around these series of open-ended questions and responses. Now, I've just picked an example here, and this is the Northern Soul fan, who was a retired chap in his 60s, talking about his involvement in the Northern Soul scene from the 1960s to the present day. So this is an example of the rich nature of data, and you might want to read through that and just see how you think it differs from a face-to-face interview. So you can see that it's quite polished, it's quite crafted. I've used parentheses there because it did go on for a lot longer, but I'll just give you a moment to read through that. I won't read it to you, and hopefully you'll be able to see the differences to the spoken word. Is that okay to move on? Still reading? I usually wait for the laugh when you see the sorry Lucy bit, when you say paid for the little sots to go through university. Yeah. So hopefully you can see here that it is quite carefully polished account of this man's involvement within Northern Soul and how music has played an important role in his life as he's grown older, and how his responsibilities and his social roles have impacted on his music scene involvement. But I think this really gives a good example of the rich and quite extensive data that email interviewing can produce. Now, I'm going to move on just to run through some of the advantages and the limitations of using email interviews or computer-mediated communication. Now, like all sociological research methods, using email interviewing has various strengths and weaknesses, and this is something that I'd say is evident in all research methods, and we just need to be aware of the limitations and the strengths. But I would argue that email interviewing does have a number of distinct strengths in comparison to, say, face-to-face interviewing. And I'm drawing on an article by Bampton and Cowton here, which I have referenced at the end of the paper if any of you are interested in following this up. So these are some of Bampton and Cowton's ideas, but I also found this in my own research. Now, through the method of email interviewing, it became clear that such email interviews are cheap, convenient, and may be more acceptable to people who are unable or do not want to attend a face-to-face interview. So Bampton and Cowton argue that in the main advantages of using computer-mediated communication are a reduction in expenditure, limited time, travel and space restrictions, and increased flexibility. And I would very much agree with this. So the respondent can answer in the personal time when it suits them. So some of the respondents would answer primarily at the weekends. They'd do it with a bottle of wine in the evenings after they finished the working week. Some would do it in the day when they had days off and fit it around their employment. So it very much affords time and pace to the participant. And this, I think, can result in very detailed answers. So, and the interviewee is able to edit, delete, and carefully consider their answer, and this can lead to high levels of rich data. Another advantage is that the email interview can lead to a reduction in researcher bias, because often the researcher and participant don't meet face to face. There's a a reduction in the level of bias and how the research can affect the participant during the interview. They can also provide an increased opportunity to gain access to a geographically dispersed group. So in my research, looking at music fans who are all over the world, or perhaps all over the UK, this was quite important. It meant I didn't have to travel to conduct the interviews. Now, as I said, a number of the interviewees took quite a long time to contemplate the responses, and this led to clear and detailed interview data. Also, a number of the respondents would email additional information regarding their experiences and opinions following their initial contact with me, so they might remember or think of more things that they wanted to add, which often can't happen once a face-to-face interview has ended. So I think in contrast to traditional face-to-face interviewing methods, the email interview offers participants a greater opportunity for reflection. So they can consider, they can reflect their answer and the data that they produce. Now, some more advantages, and again this is drawing on Bampton and Cowton. They argue that email interviews can reduce the pressure felt by nervous research participants. And there's also an ethical case that can be made in some situations for allowing research subjects to protect themselves from making injudicious comments. So in my research, recreational drug use came up quite often because I was looking at music scenes and music fans. And I think that because of the less intrusive nature of an email interview, participants felt comfortable to talk about things like recreational drug use or illegal activities. In the face-to-face interviews that I conducted, people would often talk about these issues once the tape recorder had been switched off. Then they'd talk about, they didn't want to have it on record. Whereas with an email, people didn't seem to mind bringing up injudicious comments or experiences. So there's this idea that email interviews are less intrusive than face-to-face interviews. There's a direct lack of contact that means internet methodologies can permit a degree of anonymity. And perhaps then respondents might be more likely to admit to socially undesirable behaviour. So a lot of people use email interviews for sensitive research as well, because people might be more comfortable raising sensitive issues using through email rather than a face-to-face setting. So in my research, a number of interviewees frankly discussed recreational drug consumption and other activities concerning intoxication. And as I said, in the face-to-face interview, that always happened once the recorder had been switched off and once they felt it wasn't on record. So I think the email interview encourages respondents to be honest and candid about their experiences of participating in music scenes. Another quite obvious benefit is you get a ready-made transcript. So the email interview produces the transcript for you, which obviously saves a lot of time for the researcher and gives you a lot more time for analysis. And also you avoid the pitfalls that are often common in face-to-face interviews when listening to a tape-recorded interview. Such as ambiguity when listening back to the data, and the time it can take to actually transcribe one interview. Now, just to draw on my own experiences, a number of the research participants emailed me to say that they'd really enjoyed the experience of documenting or authoring their life experiences. They enjoyed writing their personal histories of music scene involvement and their tastes, and a few of them expressed gratitude for giving them the opportunity to take part in the research. They really did seem to enjoy documenting their personal histories, and they took pleasure in the process of answering questions via email. And a lot of the email data is very eloquent prose, it's articulate, and I think this is because it's obviously carefully considered. One of the participants even went as far to ask me to write his biography with him after doing the email interview. think he was inspired that he could have a really good popular biography based on his experiences as a music fan and as a rock musician. So it's important to think about this reciprocal and reflexive nature of data generation. So within the email thread, I would often disclose personal experiences to help build rapport and establish trust. And the participant would then ask me questions alongside answering the ones that I'd ask them. So there is this reciprocity involved in email interviewing, and I think you do build up quite a significant relationship with the participants, even though you don't meet them in a face-to-face setting. Now, of course, there are limitations to email interviewing, and a fairly obvious one, again, is that we lose extra linguistic clues that we get when we meet people face-to-face. So we don't see body language, eye contact, voice inflections and facial expressions. And this could represent a decline in the quality of data gathering. But I think Bampton and Cowton point out quite a significant thing to counteract this loss, that people insert emoticons that can inject tone and personality into their accounts. So they can convey when they might be being sarcastic or when they find something humorous through smileys or LOL, meaning laugh out loud, to clarify the way that they think the phrase should be interpreted. And of course, you can email back and ask if you're interpreting things correctly. So a number of the participants did use smileys and other typographical symbols to convey meaning within their interview answers. And I did conduct some research using online message boards and discussion forums. And a lot of these typographical characters are used in these settings as well to add intended tone and humour to posts. A further limitation that Bampton and Cowton suggest is the dislocation of the interviewer and the interviewee. And this may open up an increased possibility of ignorance and misunderstanding when compared to the face-to-face interview. But I think the creation of a thread of discussion between the researcher and the respondent helps to counteract this issue. So the researcher and the respondents can email one another. We get this reciprocal process, asking for clarification, adding further information to aid the interpretation of the questions and answers that one receives. Another crucial thing to think about is this: because participants can scroll through, edit and delete their accounts, and this can lead to carefully crafted data, this obviously diminishes the spontaneity of the data that you get. So they do have this potential to become quite polished narratives. That's something that you need to be aware of if you are considering using email interviews. Now, of course, some participants may just stop emailing you altogether, so you do lose that clarification, and this can raise the issue of ambiguity. So you might have the use of non-standard language and typos in the data by some respondents in the narratives, which can lead to ambiguity regarding what the participant means. Some of them do drop out. I didn't experience that significantly within my research, but that is something that you need to be aware of. Some people may just stop emailing you after a while. So you need to maintain interest and engagement with the participants. The issue of informed consent is also important. There's an increased possibility of deception through computer-mediated communication. So there are no visible signs of a respondent's social characteristics, no signs of their age, their gender, but as Bampton and Cowton argue, this is a problem of other social research methods such as postal questionnaires, telephone interviewing. If you don't meet the participant, you just have to trust that they are who they say they are. Another thing that I've been thinking about recently is the fact that with a face-to-face interview, you get quite an embodied interviewing experience because you're sat in front of the person that you're interviewing. And I think the email interview is very much a disembodied interview experience. But I do think that this could be a strength, because it could possibly weaken the power relationships that are often evident within face-to-face interviewing. It might allow participants to open up more, to disclose more information, and perhaps to establish relationships easier because you don't actually meet face-to-face. The bulk of literature on email interviewing focuses on comparing it with face-to-face interviews. So we see a lot of literature that considers how the written and oral account differs. But I think that that's a little bit incompatible, because I think you get very different kinds of data that are produced through the two different types of interviewing methods. And I think that it'd be perhaps more fruitful to compare email interview data with written accounts, so diary accounts, mass observation directives, rather than the face-to-face interview. And as far as I can see, this hasn't yet been suggested within literature, and is something that I'm going to explore in my future work. Now, I'm just going to draw on some other research that's used email interviewing in recent years. So the first piece of research is by James and Busher, who consider ethical issues in educational research. And they talk about protecting privacy and establishing authenticity within the email interview. So they question whether email interviews are an authentic expression of the self. And they also ask whether researchers can ensure that participants' accounts are kept anonymous and private. So the issue of protecting the privacy of participants is very important. It's vital to password protect files, to have a secure email account that's obviously password protected. Another thing they raise is this issue of invisibility, not meeting the participant, as being problematic for the respondent. And this is something that they found in their research that I didn't in mine. But I think that is quite an important thing, whether some people would prefer to actually meet face-to-face and then do an email interview, but also have that face-to-face contact. And then finally, they raise this issue of authenticity. So they think about how identities are experienced and expressed online. And they suggest that participants take greater ownership of the construction and direction of narratives within email interviewing. I think this is an important thing to think about. So again, we get this idea of ownership of carefully constructed accounts, and they can direct the narrative more through the email interview. But also they do think about the issue of verifying identity in online research. So again, it's the trust issue of whether you can believe that the person is who they say they are. Now, another study, which again is educational research, is by James, that's published in 2007. So this argues for the potential that email interviewing has as a qualitative method within educational research. So it draws on research that uses email as a way of generating online narratives, and the research centred around how academics construct their identities. So the article considers the challenges that email interviewing poses for researchers who might wish to use the method as a way of studying and understanding academics' lives. And they raise these two issues, which I think are very important within online or email narratives. The nature of presentation and performance, so the idea of performing the self and presenting the self within the email interview. So these are sort of challenges to think about. But the article concludes by recognising the possibilities that the method has for increasing reflexivity, by providing both time and space for academics to construct, reflect upon and learn from their stories of experience. And I think these issues are crucial. So it allows someone to construct and reflect quite extensively on their experiences and to author their own account, which can help with interpretation and data analysis. Now, the final study I'm going to draw your attention to, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation here, Kazma and G in 2008 conducted a study looking at qualitative interviewing in internet studies. So this is a methodological paper that addresses the practical strategies, the implications and the benefits and drawbacks of collecting qualitative semi-structured interview data about internet-based research topics. So now they used 4 different interaction systems. So they compared face-to-face interviews, telephone, email and instant messaging interviews, which is a growing interview method that obviously isn't asynchronous. Email affords the asynchronicity. Now the discussion in this article reflects on the experiences of authors in performing the completed research that use these 4 interaction systems. So they looked at the functional effects, the scheduling, the logistics, the data transcription and management, as well as the methodological effects, so the ability to probe, collecting effective data and data representation. Now, the authors found that all 4 methods of data collection produced viable data for the projects they completed, but some particular issues arose around email interviewing. So they talked about that participants need to be given a choice of face-to-face, telephone, instant messaging, or email. And they also talked about this over-reliance on technology. Because you're conducting the research via a computer, you need the respondent and your own computer to work effectively. And there can be an over-reliance on technology, and obviously faults can happen. They also point out how you do get a transcript ready-made with the email interview, but the transcripts are often non-standard. So the research doesn't have the capacity to standardise the transcripts, which may allow for easier data analysis. And also, email requires planning for longitudinal participant retention. So again, this is the issue of maintaining interest and engagement with the participants. And if participants do drop out and don't answer all the questions you've asked them to, you may get incomplete data that you have to use and analyse in your research. Now, to conclude, hopefully I've given you a brief introduction to some of the strengths and challenges of using online research methods and email interviewing, but I just want to reiterate a few key points. So I think that email interviews have a number of distinct strengths, and the main one I think is that the data can be very rich and that the internet allows access to a geographically dispersed group. But it's very important that as researchers we're aware of the limitations and the various ethical issues that arise when conducting interviews via email or online. And I would suggest that email interviews are combined with traditional face-to-face techniques. And I think this can be very highly effective in obtaining a diverse sample of participants. Now, in terms of how you can find out more about email interviewing, I'm going to plug my own work, apologies for that. I've written a toolkit as part of the Realities National Centre for Research Methods, ESRC node, on using email interviews to research music in the life course, and that is available online. You can download that. I'm very open to people emailing me, so my email address is there if you'd like to get in touch and ask any questions. And we can meet face-to-face. I'm not adverse to face-to-face contact at all. And then I've just put a list of references there, which I'll leave up because I know I've sort of squashed quite a few onto that slide. So there's some of the references that I've used in this talk, and then some other important books on the topic of virtual methods and internet research. Thank you very much for listening.